One of the things that we all have realized is that, the pandemic and COVID really created the perfect storm for supply chains. However, that disruption that we were dealing with today started way before COVID, right? I mean, we were dealing with customer demands for hyper personalized experiences, global and trade tariff issues, labor force constraints within the logistics industries, and these disruptions, really will not end as COVID starts to ramp down. It's here to stay. And with that said, there will be a need for more intelligence supply chains to really prioritize transparency, the anticipation for new disruptions, and enable faster decision-making in those disruptions. So if you go to the next one, we all know and have been seeing that supply chain disruption is been dominating the headlines, right? No one would imagine that 21 would really be worse than 2020 from a supply chain perspective, but it's clearly what we're seeing. And leaders in the logistics industry believe that air freight won't be back to normal until 24. Ocean freight won't be back to normal in 23 at the earliest. And what people don't think about is things like 50% of the air cargo is in the underbelly of commercial airliners, right? And people just aren't traveling across the globe, and therefore the capacity has gone within the system, and airlines routes and flights have been reduced. And then you have the ports that we've all heard in the news. But to really make it clear and real that typically you have one or two ships waiting in a port. Now we have over 60, and that waiting time is up over 1,300%. And then on top of all of this, right, is being fueled by several other ongoing risks. And David's going to talk about how do we quantify those risks. But we have things such as energy prices and labor participation and inflation, all contributing to disruption. So if you think about all these disruptions and you go into the next one, we just firmly believe that disruptions are trending and are both increasing from frequency and scale, right? And managing that supply chain risk is going to be more challenging in the future than it has in the past. And if you look at businesses that have been surveyed, they really don't have any operational contingency plans in place, from an outbreak perspective that last longer than a few to several weeks. So with that said, these ongoing unforeseen disruptions in the center of these slides are going to be inevitable in the future. And if you head to the next one, we really need to mitigate the impact of these disruptions and disasters in a different way. And supply chains need to put an uber focus on greater resiliency. And we think it's now time that we go way beyond our traditional risk management methods and simulation tools and solutions, that organizations need the ability to have an end-to-end supply chain operations and understand how to absorb, adapt, and recover from these disruptive events. Our supply chain stress test is a pioneering concept aimed to do exactly that, from a quantitative perspective of understanding how you absorb, adapt, and recover, and quantify that resilience and provide specific set of outcomes on how to manage that disruption. So with that said, I'm going to hand it over to David, and he's going to walk us through the tests and the outcomes of the tests and how organizations are actioning against those outcomes. David?
Thank you, Chris. Welcome, everybody. Before we dive into the detail, if you can go to the next slide, just a little bit about myself. I'm on the faculty at MIT. I've been an academic for a long time at MIT over the last 21 years, but in parallel, I started a few companies, one in supply chain analytics, a company that became part of IBM Technology in 2009. And in the last 7 years, two companies, one in business analytics and the other one in cloud technologies that became part of Accenture infrastructure. At MIT, I lead the data science lab. The data science lab is a collaboration between MIT and about 25 different companies. One of the biggest one is what you see here on the screen, is a partnership between MIT Data Science Lab and Accenture. A little bit background on the stress test. We at MIT started working on stress tests and supply chain resiliency way before the pandemic. In fact, one way to reflect on what you will see in the next few minutes is to just consider the time before the pandemic. If you look at the 10, 15 years before the pandemic, we saw companies being very successful in cutting costs and increasing efficiency in their supply chain through strategies like lean, like outsourcing, and like offshoring. But these same strategies that help companies cut costs and increase efficiency dramatically increase exposure to risk. And we have seen the impact of these strategies after events like the tsunami in Japan and the flood in Thailand in 2011, or the volcano eruption in Iceland in 2010, affecting companies in a variety of industries, from high-tech to automotive, all the way to pharmaceutical. And so our focus at MIT on supply chain resiliency and stress tests started at that time. I will describe what we have developed in the next few minutes. It was initially implemented at the Ford Motor Company. There is a Harvard Business Review article that describes what was implemented. We implemented this before the pandemic at about, I don't know, maybe 15, 20 different companies, but there was not a lot of interest in the stress test and supply chain resiliency. Everything changed at the beginning of last year. And to highlight the change, let me report one incident. At the beginning of last year, when the pandemic was not hitting North America, was not hitting Europe, it was mostly concentrated in China. I was traveling, for example, in Europe. My colleague at MIT, my colleague at Accenture were traveling all over. The pandemic was hitting China. I was observing and collecting data. And then I used the framework that we developed for supply chain resiliency in 2013, 2014, to make an important prediction. And I submitted this prediction to Harvard Business Review at the beginning of February of last year. The paper appeared on Harvard Business Review website in the second half of February, and it received in 3 days thousands of clicks. What did we say in this paper? Based on the technology that we developed 6 years earlier, we basically said that the peak of the impact of COVID-19, remember, this is done at the beginning of February of last year. The peak of the impact of COVID-19 on global supply chain will happen in mid-March of 2020, forcing thousands of companies in North America and in Europe to shut down or dramatically reduce manufacturing and assembly activities. And this is exactly what happened. In mid-March, newspapers around the world reported that the automotive industry in Europe is shutting down, that the automotive industry in the US is shutting down, that other industries are shutting down. This was based on the model and the framework that was developed 6 years earlier. And so This is an opportunity for us, Accenture and MIT, to present the technology, the stress test that we develop, and why it's important for companies across a variety of industries to carefully consider the level of resiliency in their supply chain. And you will see at a high level what we will do. We will bring data and analytics to build a digital twin that allow us to identify the details of individual company level of resiliency. So let's move to the next slide. And you can see at a high level what we are focusing on. We are focusing on the ability on the left-hand side of this slide to quantify the supply chain resiliency in a sense of the ability to observe and recover and respond from a disruption anywhere in the business. Specifically, what we are going to do is quantify the level of resiliency. Now, we all are familiar with traditional KPIs that supply chain and business leaders are using. You will see that we will bring together a new set of KPIs that allow us to think carefully about the level of resiliency. In this process, we will identify hidden risk in the supply chain, and I will show you through a couple of examples that a lot of time risk is hidden in unexpected places where our intuition and experience does not highlight these places. You will see that in this process, as we quantify the level of resiliency, we will define the financial and operational exposure. By financial exposure of the company, I refer to the impact of a disruption on revenue, on profit, or on market share. By operational exposure, I will refer to the impact of a disruption anywhere in the supply chain on lost production. And this will allow us to design effective mitigation strategies. And you will see as we do that, there are, of course, requirements to increase maybe inventory in different locations, but also there are opportunities to cut costs. And I will explain this with a specific example from a company that has been using this technology for many years. You will also see that for a lot of companies that are using this technology, this is not a single shot. They are using the technology on a continuous basis to identify how dynamically things change in their business. And so let's move to the next slide, and I will show what stress tests mean. What we do when we focus on supply chain resiliency, if you look at the left-hand side, we start with supply chain mapping. We basically build a digital twin of the business, and you can see on the left-hand side something fairly intuitive. Given a company supply chain, we build this digital twin. Once we build the digital twins, which means information about product, information about facilities, information about flow, in some sense, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with, in some sense, this is similar to investment in a network design project. But once we build the digital twin, we introduce a number of new KPIs. The first one is what we call time to recover. What is time to recover? Time to recover is scenario dependent. We interview, if you look at the supply chain mapping on the left-hand side, and you look at a specific supplier, we interview the supplier to identify how long it will take the supplier to recover and return to full functionality after a disruption. Maybe 2 weeks, maybe 6 weeks, but this is information that we can collect. Notice that time to recover is scenario dependent, And also it depends on the information we collected from the supplier. We also need a KPI that is independent of a scenario and that is independent of our discussion with the supplier. And that will be time to survive. What is time to survive? Remember, we build a digital twin of the supply chain. What we do when we calculate for a specific facility time to survive is remove a facility from the supply chain. The facility may be distribution center, a manufacturing facility, a warehouse, or a transportation hub. Remove it from the supply chain and ask, without that facility in my supply chain, how long can I match supply with demand? It's not zero, because the pipeline may be full with inventory, but we can estimate this value. So remember, if you look at time to recover is associated with a specific scenario, is associated with a specific facility. And so think about a facility whose time to recover is 3 weeks. Once we have time to recover, we can calculate performance impact. We remove the facility from the supply chain for the duration of time to recover, and we ask, what is the impact on the company financial performance without that facility in the supply chain for the duration of time to recover? Because we mapped out the supply chain, we can estimate the financial impact, whether it's impact on revenue, impact on profit, or impact on market share, or we estimate the impact on lost production. And so the stress test at a high level has 3 steps. Step 1, build a focus on supply chain mapping and create the digital twin. Step 2, generate the scenario, estimate time to recover, calculate performance impact, and calculate time to survive. Remember, time to recover and performance impact will be a function of a scenario, whereas time to survive is scenario independent. And you immediately can see the intuition behind time to survive. In time to survive is very short. It means that a disruption at that facility will create a huge impact on bottom line. We are very concerned about this type of facility. But when you have a facility whose time to survive is very long, then you know that even there is a disruption, I can survive a disruption at that facility for a longer time. And on the right-hand side, you see a dashboard that provides a fairly intuitive interface that allows executives to navigate the analysis and identify hidden risk in the supply chain. So at a high level, 3 steps. Map out your supply chain and build a digital twin, run a variety of scenarios to identify performance impact, estimate time to survive, and the last step is analyze the output to identify hidden risk. Let me show you 2 examples. The first example is the very first implementation of this technology, and it is presented in the next slide. If you look at this slide, remember the first time this was implemented is at the Ford Motor Company. It's a different, of course, company than your industry, but the insight, as you will see in my next example, when we implemented the technology at multiple CPGs, is exactly the same. So you can see at the center of this slide, the supply chain mapping. It's a fairly complex supply chain. Just to illustrate the level of complexity, in Tier 1, Ford has about 5,000 different suppliers. And when you look at this supply chain and you ask, where are the risky suppliers? Where should I focus in terms of my mitigation strategies? Executives at Ford, before the technology was implemented, were focusing on strategic suppliers. Who are the strategic suppliers? Strategic suppliers are suppliers where Ford spends huge amount of money every year with each one of them. So let's look at the output from the stress test performed at Ford. And you can see 3 figures at the bottom of this slide. Let's start with the one titled risk exposure. what you see here are bubbles. Each bubble represents a tier 1 supplier. On the Y coordinate, you see annual total spend at each one of these tier 1 suppliers. And you can immediately see who are the strategic suppliers. These are the suppliers at the top of these figures. These are the suppliers where the company is spending a huge amount of money every year with each one of them. These were the suppliers that Ford executives were focused on in terms of risk mitigation strategy. The X coordinate represent risk exposure. And here Ford measured risk exposure. This is data right from the system. Ford measure risk exposure by calculating impact on lost profit. You can see just by inspection that the strategic suppliers expose Ford to some risk, but it's not the largest. The largest risk are suppliers at the bottom right-hand side. These are small suppliers that provide Ford with components that cost 10, 15, and 20%. But if these suppliers are disrupted, huge impact on bottom line. So that's the figure on the left-hand side, titled risk exposure. Now let's look at the figure in the middle, titled risky suppliers. Again, I took this straight from the Ford system. Bubbles represent tier 1 suppliers. If you look closely, different suppliers have different size bubble, different bubbles with different size. The size of the bubble is proportional to risky suppliers. You can see that Ford has, as you could expect, Ford has for the North America assembly facilities, suppliers in North America, in Europe, and in Asia. Risky suppliers are everywhere. They are not tied to a specific region. Some of them are in Asia, some of them are in Europe, and many of them are in the US. That's why the second insight, the first insight is that risk is hidden in unexpected places. The second insight is that risk is not tied up to any specific geography. You need to do this type of analysis in order to identify risky suppliers. And the last insight is from the figure at the bottom right-hand side called time to survive. What I'm showing you, again, straight from the Ford system, on the X coordinate, time to survive in weeks. And on a Y coordinate, how many tier 1 suppliers have that level of time to survive? On the left-hand side of this figure, you can see many suppliers whose time to survive is 1 day, 2 days, 3 days. These are the risky suppliers that we need to focus on. On the right-hand side of this figure, you can see many suppliers whose time to survive is 40 weeks, 50 weeks, 70 weeks. Some suppliers had time to survive for 100 weeks. Why? Because Ford invested in a lot of inventory for some of the components. As a result, time to survive was very high. Reducing inventory by 25 to 30% will still maintain the long time to survive that the company needs, but it results in dramatic cost reduction. And so this insight, one may say, is important in the automotive industry, but is it also the case in industry like yours, in the CPG industry? And that's our next example. If you go to the next slide, you can see a large CPG company, mostly operating in Europe and Latin America. We will focus on part of their business, the business in Europe. The company has 7 business units, hundreds of suppliers, thousands, as you can see, of product, many raw materials that are used in the production process, 21 manufacturing facilities, and many distribution centers. And the company operates, as you see on the left-hand side of the slide, in multiple countries, but mostly, we should emphasize, Europe and Latin America. If you go to the next slide, you can see their supply chain, a supply chain mapping. The structure is fairly simple, but the complexity is where products are made. Many products are made in one manufacturing facilities, but some products are processed in multiple facilities. Some of the process in one facility, then they are shipped to another facility where there is more process, and so forth and so on. Most of the distribution centers perform just logistics activities, but some do beyond logistic activities, which is slicing and packaging of the product. And finally, some of the product come not from their own manufacturing facilities, but rather from outside vendors, outside suppliers. And the objective was, can we identify the level of resiliency and mitigation strategies that are required? And so if you go to the next one, you can see the output from the stress test. And I classify them into a number of categories. The first is looking at their suppliers. You can see that a few suppliers are responsible for huge impact on gross profit. If they are disrupted, big impact on the company bottom line. But in particular, forget about suppliers, in particular, the smallest and oldest manufacturing facilities that the company had, if this facility is disrupted, the impact on the company gross profit will be at least 50%. That is an unbelievable insight that executives were not focusing on when they were thinking about the level of supply chain resiliency in their network. If you look at the right-hand side, we see significant impact on gross profit that is caused by very few suppliers. And finally, the analysis identify the impact on different product categories and different SKUs by country and by region. Let me pause here and return the podium to Chris and Maria.
So this is a very significant conversation for all of us that are working in supply chain strategies for consumer goods. Again, my name is Maria Rey-Marston, and I lead our supply chain innovation group here in North America. So this is an area where we are considering and bringing to market some considerable new thought leadership and tools like this. So if you go to the next slide, this is the question that we get most frequently after this discussion on the stress test, and how the stress test kind of help companies build resiliency and understand the position they have today. As you probably guess, this tends to be a data-intensive exercise, but in our experience, most of the data that is required, you already have it. Almost every CPG we've ever worked with has done a network optimization process. You may have your data to understand what is the current configuration of your network, and it will be a matter of use some of the data that you have precisely to build that digital twin that David was speaking about. The second big step here, and that is the role of the companies commissioning this work, is to have a series of meetings and interviews with all of you, supply chain and procurement leaders, in some cases with risk management teams, to basically understand your current configuration, but also to confirm some of the assumptions that will be modeled in the digital twin. And also, I think, as David mentioned before, to start thinking about what are some of those scenarios that can be predefined to start quantifying your degree of resiliency. In terms of the data that is used, we request, and again, I don't think this is terribly complex or difficult to gather data, information on your locations, your data master file, your material master file, an understanding of your inventory levels for both critical materials, maybe work in process, finished goods, and your estimations on independent demand and demand forecast, basically trying to predict how many days of inventory you may have in your network or in a particular node. Then another big piece of information here is the information around your distribution and transit times. This model relies on some assumptions regarding lead times and your ability to respond to a disruption in your transportation lanes or the business with your carriers. So I think this is an important set of data that will be required, including some bill of material information, cost information. And as we build the different scenarios of disruption and we try to estimate the financial impact on that disruption, had you not built the right resiliency, is going to be important to understand some of your key financial drivers for the process. This typically it's a 10 to 12 week exercise, and typically within the first week we'll commit to the scope, to either the full network or a section of your network, run a few of the interviews within the first month, start gathering and cleansing the data to go into the model, update and run the model with the different scenarios, and towards the last 3 or 4 weeks, generate some of the outcomes that David showcased, both from the automotive sector and the food sector. So as you consider how to improve your resiliency, we have next slide, a couple of questions for you, and just to take a pulse from this audience, we would love to learn, and you will see a survey window that is popping up in your Zoom. If we'd like to know if you have mapped or you have in existence a digital twin of your current supply chain. Do you have a digital twin of your network with the right nodes, transit times, inventory levels, and the information that goes on a digital twin? And the second question is, to which degree, full, partial, or not at all, do you have visibility of your supplier's supply chain? And this second question obviously relates to the fact that some of the risks that you may have and the need to build resiliency is a function also of the resiliency and the degree of your supplier base to withstand some of these supply chain disruptions. So if you kind of help us with some of these answers, it will be very, very significant for us to take a look at that. And if you go to the next slide, the reason why this is important is because one piece of building resiliency is certainly the diagnostics piece. And to that point, the stress test is a very important point for simulation, for diagnosis of your current degree of resiliency. But most of the projects that we are currently working on to build that resiliency required intervention with your suppliers, intervention in your supply chain, in your distribution strategies. And that's where things are very interesting in terms of the portfolio of solutions that will enhance your supply chain resiliency. And there are solutions, depending on the case, obviously, that are very closely connected to supplier management. And how do you manage measure the resiliency of your suppliers, how collaborative your supply chain relationships are, what degree of visibility you have on your suppliers' supply chain. So big pocket of solutions in the supplier management space, and that obviously comes back clockwise into some of the strategies around sourcing and procurement to diversify your supply base, to find secondary supply sources, buffering of some of your sourcing points, and just try to create a more centralized risk model versus a silo perspective on risk by function or by node in your network. If you keep going clockwise, you will see some opportunities to build resiliency around the integrated planning, inventory planning, distribution planning, execution, intelligent execution, mostly around control towers that can actually detect signals of distress and will allow you to create points of intervention much faster once you have that centralized risk model. And in many cases, there is a big task, if you will, to identify protocols of response with carriers, with suppliers, and in many cases with customers. Internally, within your supply chain functions, you will see some typical solutions to enhance your resiliency around some of your internal traditional supply chain functions, more adaptability of your workforce across business processes, better cross-functional collaboration, and a lot of data flows that can be interpreted by different functions in a coherent way. In manufacturing, if you go to the left-hand side of the slide, we also see a number of strategies to build resiliency. And as I said, in addition to the diagnostics and the measurement, we see some strategies around product redesign, product reformulation, process redesign, and in many cases, a rebuild, as we're talking at Accenture today, a rebuild of some of your manufacturing strategies. Then we're looking at collaborations, finding redundancy with third parties, or minimizing exposure to risk if you use a lot of contract manufacturers that may bring you some level of risk that you may not be accounting for. Within distribution and fulfillment, I think they tend to absorb, as you all know, they tend to absorb the largest degree of risk because it's accumulating some of the challenges from upstream processes and some of the risk exposure from suppliers upstream. So by the time we get into distribution centers, warehouses, last mile delivery, carriers, distribution modes, a few ideas here, also connecting with visibility and finding new ways to do postponement in your fulfillment, making your last leg of distribution as close as possible, obviously within your financial capacity, making that last leg of distribution relatively closer to demand, and certainly using and leveraging data to determine a best course of response in specific events. In transportation, I think some of the best practices that we see in sourcing and procurement are migrating to carriers' relationship management. And we've had this conversation with our friends from Coyote Logistics as we talk about carrier management and asset and fleet management within your distribution strategy. So what we're trying to say here is the solution will be different depending on the configuration of your network and the configuration of your supply chain, but certainly is going to be a portfolio of points of intervention guided by the data and the diagnostic results from the stress test and some of the metrics that David and Chris mentioned before. So as we close this section and open our Q&A, we wanted to pose this question to all of you, and feel free to share this with us in terms of where do you see the biggest vulnerability in your supply chain? Is it an internal or an external vulnerability? Is it a vulnerability coming from your suppliers, coming from your customers, from your business partners, or you see a vulnerability in your internal processes? Could be both, could be neither, but as I pose this question, I think Tom and James, this could be a good point to open the floor for a few questions from the audience.
Thank you so much to all of our presenters for that really insightful presentation. As Maria mentioned, we've reached the Q&A portion of this session. If you have a question for any of our speakers, you just want to drop that into the Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen, just to kick us off and get the conversation going before turning over to any questions that the audience has. If you're a CPG, if you're looking to build resiliency, and maybe undertake this stress test or start down this path, what is the likely path forward, or like what's really required if you want to like roll up your sleeves, get going on this, in terms of building out that digital twin of what's involved, just to even give it a sense for what people would be undertaking if they're gonna do that.
And I see some familiar names in our participants, so please feel free to chime in. May not be a question. If you have some unique strategies to build resiliency in your supply chain that you would like to share, please also help us and the attendees with some of your experiences so far.
Oh, and just Maria, to clarify, I meant the question more for you and David and Chris, just in terms of what the CPGs would need to do if they want to undertake the stress test process.
Let me reflect on this with the examples that I mentioned of a CPG company, consistent with your question. If you are a CPG and you're interested in identifying the level of resiliency, as Maria said, a project of this type takes perhaps around 10 weeks. But what does it mean? About 60%, 60 to 70% of the time is dedicated to collecting the data, cleaning the data, building the model. Remember, the supply chain mapping. And the remaining time is all about the stress test itself. Very much what I described now is consistent with what you would have been doing if you were focused on a network design project. So making sure that we have the data, that we are able to build a good, accurate supply chain mapping and validated by looking at the baseline. This is probably the very first thing. Now, the good news is a lot of companies have focused on network design before. So if you did that, you are almost there in terms of the first steps that I described, because you have the supply chain mapping already from your network design capability.
So Tom, I just got kind of an initial view on the survey response on the two questions, and almost like equally divided, but our responses from this session show that 43% of responses, participants have a partial map of their supply chain using a digital twin. And 57% have not built a digital twin of their network. And I will start there. How important it is in CPG to have a digital representation of your network as rich and accurate and dynamic as possible. And to that extent, about half of the respondents also mentioned that they have partial visibility to their suppliers' supply chain, and 50% do not have visibility of their suppliers' supply chain. So that speaks to two challenges. The majority of the risk exposure in some of our CPG supply chains is probably not coming from your internal processes. We've had a few decades to perfect our inventory planning, our distribution, our logistics. It seems to be, though, that some of the exposure and lack of resiliency is coming from vulnerabilities in your supplier base, in your network of partners. And if you don't have visibility on what's happening there, it's probably another good point to start.
Yes, and I think that's a great, it points us towards the need to do the stress test, right? I mean, to really understand where that risk exposure is, and those associated suppliers, and the ability to figure out what would be the time to survive.
In fact,
right.
Chris, this data that Maria just described is very much consistent with similar data that we collected from other events with other companies. But there are two insights from this data that are important to keep in mind. The first insight is it is within your capability to achieve your own supply chain mapping. This is something that companies should and can do. The second insight is related to the question about your visibility to your supplier supply chain. Many companies do not have that, and it will be very difficult to have that. And so they ask, okay, if I don't have visibility to my supplier supply chain, what can I do? There is a lot that you can do. And here is what we have done at the Ford Motor Company. The Ford Motor Company had visibility to some of their suppliers' supply chain, but not everybody. What they identify through their analysis are risky suppliers, and they put in the contract resiliency requirements. So the contract focus on cost, focus on quality, focus on lead time, as well as resiliency measure like time to recover. And after our method was published, we saw that Toyota require specific time to recover from each one of their tier one suppliers. Why are they doing that? Because it creates a domino effect. It forces the supplier to make sure that they can respond in the time committed to by the contract.
That makes a lot of sense. And just a follow-up question, just because I'm waiting for maybe some entries in the Q&A box, but David, you touched on the need to clean data, or really, the data is, what drives much of this. And so if you're thinking about what types of data are required, or what's generally, what you're generally looking for, can you just walk us through that?
Yeah. So there are, I would say, 3 levels of data. The different products that the company have, and the recipes that they use, and the raw material that they apply, the specific facilities that they have, whether it's manufacturing facility, remember my example of a CPG, whether it's manufacturing, distribution, warehouses, transportation hub, or some outside suppliers that provide perhaps finished goods to their distribution center. And the third one is the flow. Hey, the flow today in our supply chain is for this product, from this facility to that facility, and from there to a retail outlet. Once you think that way, product, including raw material and component, location and facility, and the flow internally, you immediately get an understanding of the supply chain mapping that takes you into our first step of implementing a digital twin.
Got it. And then sort of a follow-up there, when you talk about sort of assessing risk or sort of quantifying that, I assume that many of these events have to be put almost into that like quantitative framework, right? Like, what does a pandemic mean, or what does a natural gas pipeline explosion mean, or what, like, how do you sort of take potential real world events and translate those into what is sort of a model that ultimately is really math and data driven.
This is really at the heart of the challenge. And let me put a caveat just to highlight why this. When we are preparing and focusing on supply chain resiliency, we don't want only to reflect on past events, because tomorrow there will be another event, unlike, for example, COVID, unlike, for example, the tsunami in Japan. This is why in the technology, in the framework that Accenture and MIT developed, we have measures that are scenario dependent, like what you described, but we have measures that are scenario independent. Let me be very specific. Time to survive is scenario independent. I don't look at any scenario. That's why it allows me to identify hidden risks independent of what happened. Time to recover, as you pointed out, is scenario dependent. And so we start by identifying a variety of scenarios, and then given each scenario, we try to identify what is the time to recover for a specific facility, for a specific location, for a specific warehouse. And it's the combination of time to recover and time to survive that give you an insight into the level of resiliency and the level of exposure that the company has.
Got it. All right, let me ask one more sort of provocative question. If you go back to pre-COVID, let's just say that every CPG, most major multinational companies had underwent some sort of a stress test exercise, that this wasn't a 57% have not done a digital twin, but like 100% have. Would you have seen the same type of supply chain disruptions out of COVID, or what would that have looked like? How would that have played out?
I love your question. Why? Because last month, the CEO of Schneider Electric, Annette Clayton, and myself gave a talk about why Schneider Electric was able to survive the disruption of the pandemic better than the competition. And it's exactly what you are describing. Everybody is suffering. There is no question that the pandemic is affecting Schneider and its competitors. But because Schneider Electric invested in the type of resiliency we are focusing on, they were able to weather the storm much, much better than others. They still suffer, but the competition saw dramatic impact on their business. And so the same is true in CPG. If you have a company in this audience that prepared and identified resiliency and prepared mitigation strategies, they will still suffer, but not at the same level as the other. And that's really the name of the game. You want to be able to outperform the competition in the current environment.
Definitely.
Well, I will say, Tom, that many companies have built some degree of flexibility and redundancy in their supply networks without thinking of a systemic disruption as we've had in the last 18 years. So some companies, as they said, better lucky than good, because I think you also see companies that, because of other reasons, they had built some degrees of adaptability, and they've been working in certain industries just to protect some of that level of disruption. I think where we see kind of the common denominators is companies that had more distributed relationships, where they could actually spread risk with some degree of governance of the supply chain of their business partners, tend to fare better. I agree with David that everybody suffered, but some companies suffer more than others. I think as we think of CPGs, companies that were single channel or very few channels of distribution had a more painful time than companies that were more omni-channel. Companies that had single points of sourcing for raw materials or for packaging and ingredients suffer more than companies that had reformulated their products and had more flexibility in their sourcing and their formulation. So I think the good news, hopefully we will not see a disruption of this nature again too soon, but I think it's never too late to bring flexibility and adaptability into your network. It helps you in the short term, and it also helps you with a potential catastrophic disruption.
Well, I couldn't agree more. And just the opportunity I think that presents for CPG to undertake this type of exercise in collaboration with you all, I think is definitely out there. So if you are a CPG company on the call and you want to learn more about this, we're happy to help to facilitate some of those conversations and just get that underway. Because as Maria, you sort of alluded to, there's also then, in undertaking these exercises and identifying where there are risks, it gives you the opportunity to address those and to start building out the solutions to mitigate that and respond accordingly. We are coming up to the close of our hour. So Chris, Maria, and David, I just wanted to thank you all for your time and for your partnership with the Consumer Brands Association. We definitely look forward to the next time that we can convene and share additional insights from Accenture during future sessions. I think the big takeaway is, again, just that this opportunity exists to assess risk in the supply chain, to conduct this type of mapping exercise and really pinpoint where there are some of those challenges, that it's very much viable with the right types of data sharing arrangements and the right model that David has really pioneered. And so hopefully we can use this as a basis for some of these future conversations with CPGs in orienting the industry to what is clearly an emerging best practice. On December 8th, I just wanted to add one really quick thing. Consumer Brands will host another industry solutions session focused on digitizing the trade promotion management process. And a link to register for this session is in the chat. So thank you all again. Chris, if you just want to say one final thing, that would be great, and we can close today's session.
Absolutely. To Maria's point, hopefully not soon we'll see disruption, but it's more than likely. And I think one great takeaway for this industry is that the application of this stress test has been applied to, I would say, more complex networks, right, in other industries, and we've learned quite a bit. So the approach and the expeditious fashion of how we can get to outcomes, I think there's just a tremendous opportunity for CPG from all the learnings that we've had over the last year and a half deploying this capability and diagnostic.
Wonderful. Well, thank you guys again. Have a great rest of your day. And for those in attendance, thank you for joining.